Now the old village centre with the bandstand is still there and now operates as a neighbourhood centre. It wouldn't have survived in the incrementalist model. The mid-block route of the Sligo gateway city I often used as an example as well, where we eventually built the mid-block route, destroying a lot of the heritage buildings or the old buildings in Sligo, because there wasn't sufficient growth to justify a western bypass. So skipping a stage and sometimes building too big, like a mother buying a coat for a child and saying you'll grow into it, is the idea on the right, where if we had built the western bypass with a new bridge that people are talking about in relation to Sligo now again, we might have had a big road system, too big for Sligo for a long time, but the spatial solution might be better in the long run. These are the type of issues I think that Dublin should be looking at if we imagine the growth might happen. So the three scenarios, you're familiar with these, that were considered in the study were the Eastern Corridor, the Atlantic Gateway linking up the cities in the west, and essentially the urban sprawl, the trend scenario, the fragility of Mayfain. And the Eastern Corridor was concluded the most likely and robust option. That's why we are here today as well, I think, that the Atlantic Corridor would require strong public investment and transfer, and that it would not be robust in times of economic uncertainty or decline, and that the urban sprawl would be environmentally very doubtful. So for those reasons, now once we adopted the Eastern Corridor as a concept, and you then superimpose the National Spatial Strategy onto it, you come to some interesting conclusions. First of all, that we should ask the question, is the radial model that we have based all our road infrastructure on, is it perhaps ill-conceived? That we should be developing something like the picture on the right-hand side, and linking the gateway cities in the west, and remember this was the workshops for the individual gateways outside Dublin, to this Eastern Corridor rather than all to Dublin. This would actually allow a potential for linking cities much closer to this urban region than we are currently doing. So essentially a change from concentric and radial thinking to linear and transversal thinking. The implications of the transverse thinking is that you could have the shortening of travel times, although you would have to build a lot of new roads probably, but also that there would be an option and perhaps a logic for a dual transport corridor to carry the high growth in the Dublin-Belfast corridor. And these are some spatial manifestations of that. The blue circles representing the gateway cities as identified in the National Spatial Strategy. No change to those, linking them at shorter distances to different parts of the eastern urban corridor, so that Cork might actually focus on Waterford rather than on Dublin. But also this second transport corridor, which would run in parallel to the existing one, but would be much less vulnerable to coastal erosions or to climate change, and therefore could be inland a good bit. And if you continue that thinking, it is not too far out of the way to come up with a high-speed railway line between Belfast, Dublin and Limerick, which would actually link gateway cities again, which would link the western area to the east, but would also link three international airports on the island, Belfast, Dublin and Shannon, which has of course a lot of capacity. So these are some of the spatial ideas that are a consequence of the adoption of the Eastern Corridor model. This is another idea that we floated during one of the workshops, which was the consequence of building a railway line connection between the west and the east, rather than going to Cork, going to Limerick, which then means that Cork again should not so much focus on Dublin, but should focus on Limerick, and Galway should do the same in order to get the maximum benefit of such a high railway line. And the circle in the middle there between Cork and Limerick is actually a small town, Charleville, which would be ideally situated on that transport line and has plenty of land capacity. Each time I travel to Cork, I look out of the window, there's a lot of land. So the risk of current policy, the balanced regional development. I was on the advisory committee for the National Spatial Strategy, and I observed the National Spatial Strategy started with the premise, two reasons for doing it. One was the need for the west of Ireland to get economic growth and population. That was the push factor, the pull factor. The other one was the push factor, the Dublin congestion. We have identified, I think, in this study that Dublin congestion is a misnomer. Dublin is not congested, and I would love if this could be explored today. Dublin is only congested in the old-fashioned radial model of spreading out and everybody working in the city centre. Dublin is not congested if you go for a linear model and you are allowing development to take place in the hinterland. And of course, it is interesting when you analyze those data, slightly tongue-in-cheek. I did it at a planning conference in my presidential address, just to simply to show what is actually happening, that the counties that had gateway cities actually grew slower during the recent intercensual period than the counties that did not have gateway cities. So we interpreted that in the study as actually saying the NSS, while perhaps laudable, politically correct or whatever, it's actually concentrating on the weak children in the class. Now that is, very often educators have to make up their mind. Should we bring the weak children up to a common denominator of mediocrity, or should we encourage the very strong students to excel, and should they get extra support? And that educational dilemma is, I suppose, a dilemma that you could say the national government now has in these kind of ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henk.